This week on Buffering, we are going to follow up on a conversation we had about a year ago, all about climbing the ladder or mastering the craft and talking about your next career move. And Gabe, this was a conversation we had about 12 months ago to the date. I think you looked that up, and June 2024 was the last episode we talked about this.
Yeah, exactly. I was curious when we had this conversation just because it felt like it was a while ago. And so I was curious and I looked it up, and it was June 2024 that we had this exact conversation around what people should be doing with their careers. And I think there's some interesting statistics, Zach, that you found around new folks that are in the workplace that we should be talking about. And I think there's a lot more meat to dive into here on this topic. And it's just going to be, I think it's going to be a really fun one today as we get into the details.
I love it, Gabe. And I kind of want to kick it off with a generational spin on this as well, because I think you read a lot about Gen Z in the news and how they have high demands and whether or not they like working from home and the work-life balance. And this is all true. This is a generation that prioritizes that work-life balance. They embrace technology and innovation, and of course, seek that meaning in the work that they do. And Gabe, I don't know if you knew this, but there are more than 50 million Gen Z employees in the United States alone. And I thought that was I don't know if I would say a surprising number, but it's a pretty big number.
I was surprised at how big it was. It is a very large number. 50 million people working in the United States fall into this Gen Z category. And I had to go look this up, Zach, because I was just curious as to what the official definition of Gen Z is. And it is people who are born between 1997 and 2012. And I told you that it sort of made me feel a million years old because I graduated high school in 1998. And so a lot of these folks who were, as I was moving into adulthood were, born or barely born are now in the workforce. And it reminds me that there is this big group of people that are in that generation slightly behind me that are now of working age. And as we think about what career trajectory looks like for folks, we really need to take their thoughts, their considerations, their desires into this as we're talking about what a quote unquote successful career looks like.
Exactly, Gabe. And I think just to build on that too, two things. Number one, is this going to be like one of those back in my day podcast episodes?
Probably.
But two is, I think, understanding these expectations that Gen Z has is going to help you as an organization better attract and retain top talent. And when we go back to the 50 million number, this is a growing number. More and more Gen Z, Gen Alpha even here coming up is going to be joining the workforce as well. So again, when we're looking at top talent, Gen Z is your demographic here. But one of the things I thought was funny here with that top talent is 70% of Gen Z here in this study wanted to be promoted within the first 18 months. Gabe, what do you think about that statistic?
It was a very high percentage. And I think what's interesting is in the report that you sent me, Zach, was the perception difference of the Gen Z workers versus perception of leaders who are managing these Gen Z employees, and that disconnect, which I think is interesting. But that 70% number really jumped out to me of wanting to be promoted in the first 18 months. And we're going to get into this in a bit more detail later in the podcast. But for folks who listen to the podcast that we did about a year ago, you'll remember we talked about this idea of, people leader versus high level individual contributor. And I guess the thing that really jumped out to me, Zach, when I read that 70% number is if you are a business whose only path to promotion is through people leadership, you're potentially disenfranchising a whole set of workers because they don't see a clear path to that in a relatively short period of time, which is what they're looking for.
Yeah, and the thing with Gen Z too is they're not afraid to bounce, which I always think is funny. But going off that too, because I thought this was interesting too, but in this same study, it talked about how Gen Z is most likely to use AI tools for problem solving, research, data analysis, efficiency, and it called these the boring tasks. And Gabe, I thought you would love that, first of all, but it also talked about how Gen Z is also looking at companies who don't adapt these new technologies and how they're less favorable when viewed from that Gen Z standpoint to work for.
Yeah, they're going to avoid companies who are not embracing these types of tools, which that one didn't surprise me at all. It makes a lot of sense. Younger folks obviously going to be more interested in technology, AI being on the forefront of everything that's happening from a technological perspective. So if you're not leaning into these tools, you're likely leaving people behind. And that, I think, is one of the big things that's changed, Zach, since the last time we talked about this, is the proliferation of AI tools being used in corporate and being used in a day-to-day basis to do those quote unquote boring tasks.
It's it's great. I was actually talking to a colleague here, and Gabe, one of the quotes we said on a previous podcast was from one of our previous leaders, and it was all about how if you don't track it, it's a hobby. And
Mm-hmm.
one of my colleagues here said, "Well, what if tracking things is your hobby?" And I thought, you know what, that's a total Gabe quote here with some of the conversations we've had. But
I am
those
surprised I didn't say that.
I know, like those boring tasks. Here we are. But the last one here, Gabe, and I simply wanted to bring this up because, of course, we're on a podcast. But Gen Z loves podcasts. This is one of the biggest demographics that listen to podcasts, not only for entertainment, but for taking something away, for learning something new. And Gabe, this is something we've actually seen with our own data. If you look at that younger demographic, it's not our number one, listing group, but I think it's our second or third, when you break it down by different age ranges too. So the data shows, Gen Z does love podcast.
Mm-hmm. And again, that one's not as big of a surprise because the Gen Z group has grown up with podcasts. The folks in other age demographics, like myself and even older, we've had to kind of adopt that as a way to entertain, as a way to learn. But Gen Z folks just sort of grew up with it. So I think it's a great point, Zach, of how are companies leveraging podcasts to attract that Gen Z audience and make sure that you're, providing something that's actually beneficial to them.
And again, not only just for the workforce, but again, next week we'll talk about it more, but for your
Mm-hmm.
consumers as well. But on the opposite
Yep.
side of this coin here, I want to talk about a little bit about how leaders see Gen Z. And within this same study, it talked about how 40% of leaders saw Gen Z graduates, so college graduates, as being unprepared. And I thought this was funny in part due to communication skills and work ethic. But also within that same chart, the next one was a lack of technology skills, being able to use your basic business applications, Gabe, your Excel, and I thought that one was pretty interesting too.
See, that one surprised me a little bit because, like, I know, just from working with like you as an example, there's this group of people that are behind me from a generation perspective. If they don't know how to use something, they generally figure it out pretty darn fast. Whether that be through, hey, I'm going to go watch a bunch of YouTube videos, or now I'm going to go, do a bunch of AI searches and figure out how to do this. There is a yes, they may not necessarily know, and perhaps this is the disconnect that happens. Is a leader asks you, do you know what's your proficiency with Excel? Well, if you're just coming out of college, you may say, I don't understand it very well, but you can learn it very rapidly because there's, again, so much information and so much, well, just resource to be able to go out and learn it rapidly. So to me, it's yes, the technological skills may be a gap, but that gap is going to get closed really rapidly with folks in the Gen Z generation because they are going to go learn it really, really quickly.
Speaking for myself, Gabe, if I don't know something, I don't want to say like AI is the first place I go, but as of the last 12 months, that's the first place I go.
Mm-hmm.
Gabe, we've talked about this. I think we've talked about like, home repair maintenance projects. If you don't know how to do something, going right into AI and figuring that out. But since graduating from college here a couple years ago now, if I don't know something, I immediately go and figure out what I need to do to find the answer, whether that's YouTube, AI, a Google search, whatever that may be. But I do have to say, with some of the latest AI tools and advancements, I feel like I'm constantly learning. Like you didn't just stop after college. And to your point, oh, I don't know how to use Excel. I just graduated. Blah blah blah. What's my license plate now, Gabe? It's like that's
Excel
not that I didn't
SX,
know how to
buddy.
use Excel, but I was definitely more of a novice then. But the last thing here, Gabe, and I really want your input on this, but the study also talked about managers saying that Gen Z has fostered a more casual atmosphere in the workplace. And I know you've been here at this company for 20 years or so. So I'm curious to hear from you how things have changed as we've hired, different generations.
Yeah, I would say this is true, that there is definitely a more casual style, whether that's, casual dress, whether that's casual communication style, those sorts of things have definitely been fostered over the last, 20 to 25 years. Like when I first started working, going into an office, not at Calix, but at a previous company, it was very buttoned down. Everybody was wearing like Dockers and, a button up shirt, and you kind of felt like you had to get like dressed up almost to go to work. That definitely does not happen anymore. Feel like it's a much more casual environment from that perspective. So, I would agree with this, that whether that's just all of us getting a little bit more casual in the way that we approach things, dress and communication, or if Gen Z sort of pushed us there, regardless, work is a lot more casual than it used to be, for sure.
It's funny. I don't really I can't relate to you on this one, Gabe. But just this week, I made a joke with a colleague where I asked a serious question, and I made a joke. I said, "You can tell it's a serious question because I use capital letters and I actually spelled the words out instead of using like the Gen Z slang here." But I think the communication styles is the biggest one. For me, even like if someone ends a sentence in like dot dot dot, I feel like it's the Gen Z in me, but I'm like, oh, like what do they mean? Like am I in trouble? Like what was the dot dot dot? What's coming next kind of thing. But the communication styles between the generations is probably the one that I've picked up on the most. But I think where we work, Gabe, I don't want to say we're very casual, but the way we communicate, whether it's the gifts or the fun conversations we have on the side, Gabe, the saltiness and the honesty you bring into conversations as well. I feel like it's pretty nice place to be.
Agreed. Yes, it's important to be able to have those. I like the fact that it's gotten a little bit more casual, and like you said, the gifts and things like that. And so much of that is just driven from taking some of that stuff in our personal lives and bringing it to work. Like you said, the more casual conversation that you would, the things that you would send in a text message to a friend have sort of started to forklift, their way into work. I was joking with a colleague yesterday because he had shared something and it was basically like multiple gifts around a single statement. And I was joking with him that gifts are his love language because it was just like he explained things so perfectly in multiple gifts. It was really good. He like barely even needed the sentence to explain what it was that he was talking about. It was awesome.
I love that. But Gabe, Gen Z aside, let's talk about career growth and what this progress can look like a little bit. I know this is a topic that you're passionate about.
Yeah, and the reason, part of the reason I wanted to come back to this topic is it feels like it's a conversation that I've had with many people lately. And as I was thinking about the outline for this and the conversation here today, Zach, I feel bad sometimes because I feel like I'm constantly trying to talk people out of leadership positions. And it's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is I just want people to understand that there's a different path. And it's important to understand that there are multiple growth paths to your career. You could go down a people leadership path. You could go down the high level individual contributor path. It's both of those things are very okay. And I feel like, unfortunately, in the corporate world, we do a lot of disservice to people who don't want to go down that people leadership path by not giving them a path to growth and success and promotion. To go back to that statistic that you mentioned earlier, Zach, about Gen Z, 70% of Gen Z employees expect that they're going to be promoted in the first 18 months. Are they going to be promoted into people leaders? I highly doubt that.
Let's
So
hope not. Maybe. Man.
well, I mean, think about it. Like when I was 18 months into my career, was I ready to be a people leader? God, no. That was not something that I was ready for. And most people are not ready for that. So if they're expecting a promotion path and a career growth path, but there isn't one, we're doing people a disservice.
It's funny, Gabe. I'm coming up on I don't know how many years, 3 years, 4 years now here at Calix, and I would also say I'm not ready to be a people leader, but that's also something that I'm not, too invested in right now. So I think that's a great call out, especially when you think about Gen Z in their 18-month promotion expectation. what does that promotion look like? And this is something that, Gabe, we should probably dive into the data a little bit more, but I'd be very interested to see exactly that. What does Gen Z expect from a promotion? Is it a title? Is it a pay change? Is it a role itself, new responsibilities? I think that's a very good question to ask.
It's a really important question, and I totally agree with you because obviously we all work for money, right? And we want to. Part of excelling in your career is getting paid more money. That's just a reality, and part of the way you perceive value to the organization is them paying you more, right? So there is definitely a growth path. There's a growth path there with pay, and I think that's an important component of this. But you bring up a really good point. It could be that people perceive a promotion in title or a promotion in responsibility or getting to work on a special project or something like that as a quote unquote promotion. And when leaders in an organization don't approach it in that multi-pronged approach of, okay, I need to understand what this person really desires and what motivates them. It may be that you're throwing money at a problem that isn't an actual money problem, or it may be that you're throwing a title at a problem that isn't a title problem. So it's really understanding that as a people leader and then making sure that you're aligning that to the right goal.
And Gabe, what this kind of ties back to is the strategic thinking and the strategic doing. Again, we talked about this about a year ago, but for those who maybe joined us in the past 12 months, Gabe, can you walk us through what that strategic thinking role is compared to that strategic doing?
Yeah, I think this is, as you said, this is something that we talked a little bit about, but just to reiterate this, it was when people get promoted, they often get promoted because they want to be doing strategy, right? Like they feel like I can be this strategic thinker. The reality is that there are very, very few people inside an organization that their entire job is just strategic thinking. Like when I think about, you know, our organization, Zach, there's a high level group of people at the C-level suite who are thinking about and setting strategy. And then there's a whole bunch of people underneath those that are hopefully strategic doing, right? There's still strategy to the things that they're doing, but they're not necessarily thinking about the high level strategy of the business. Again, there's very few people inside a company who are actually going to do that. So you can still have a very successful career and be wildly impactful in an organization by being a strategic doer. And what I mean by that is not just doing the thing that somebody tells you to do, but thinking about what is the outcome that we're looking to drive here? And how can I take my knowledge and my experience and make that outcome better by thinking strategically about the thing that I am doing? Anybody can take a task and do that task. Taking and becoming a strategic doer is very different.
And Gabe, I think you actually have some experience being a people leader. And one of the next things we were going to talk about here was when you are a people leader, a person leader, you have not only your direct reports, but you have a boss that you report to as well. So you have that player coach mindset as well. Gabe, can you talk to me a little bit about this?
Yeah, so this is again, me trying to talk people out of being a people leader. This is one of the things that I talk about all the time when this gets brought up. Is again, there is one person in our organization that doesn't have a boss, quote unquote, and even that person kind of has a boss in the board of directors. But if you're the CEO, you don't really have a boss. Okay. And that's kind of the only person who's not a player coach. Everybody else inside of an organization where you're at, if you're, in that leadership role, there's likely work that you have to do. And then there's coaching that you have to deliver to your team. Being a player coach is a really tough role. And just being really honest and being forthright about what I struggled with when I was a people leader, this is the part that I really struggled with, was that balance of player coach. I still had a whole bunch of work that I needed to do. I had clients that I was working with. I had activities that I needed to do. And then I needed to coach a team to do those same things. That was a real struggle for me. It was hard to find that balance. And I think that's where a lot of people leaders struggle, is in that balance of player coach. So knowing if you're going to head down that leadership path, you have to understand that you probably are going to be in that player coach role. You've got a boss still, they've got things that they're telling you to do, and you've got actual work that you need to do, as well as making sure that your team is doing those things. And again, that's where I think a lot of folks fall down.
And I want to kind of circle back to a topic we kind of introduced at the beginning of the podcast. And I talked about AI a little bit and how Gen Z really likes AI. Gabe, I know you and I are both, I would argue, we're both power users of AI at this point. I was actually just talking to a friend here outside of our company this week, and I said, I feel like I'm not using AI enough. But then I think about how much I use AI, and it's already a very high amount. And then I think of how productive I've been. Gabe, I do some graphic design projects on the side. And I feel like, in that role, I have someone to bounce ideas off of. And that to me is very valuable. Of course, we have our own AI use cases within our company. I don't want to dive too deep into those. There's also the productivity suite of the AI use cases,
Mhm.
things in like Outlook and Teams. But Gabe, I want to talk a little bit about that high level IC and how they can leverage AI to be more productive.
Well, that's the part that as we were thinking about this, I got even more excited about how AI comes into our day to day activities. Because as a high level individual contributor, you want to do things that are of high value and you want to automate as many of the things that are not, right? And how can I be more productive? I was having this conversation with a colleague recently where we were talking about, she was talking about how she was really busy and, struggling with, just having too much to do. And so I encouraged her to sit down for a week and write down every single thing that you are doing on a day-to-day basis. It's going to be a painful week, right? But really just sit down and like every activity, write it down, write it down, write it down, and think about how many of those things could be automated by AI. And I'll bet there's a number of tasks and activities that could be automated or could be done in a more efficient way.
These are the boring tasks we talked about, right?
Correct. The boring tasks. Exactly. How do I get those quote unquote boring tasks out of the way? Whether that's, notes, whether that's, sending email follow-ups, whether that's, communicating back up to your boss of a specific task or something like that. What are those things that can be done in a more automated way? And if you're in a customer facing role, and Zach, we're going to talk more about customer facing stuff here in a minute, but if you're in a customer facing role, the best way for you to spend your time is listening to customers. So, how can I eliminate as many of those quote unquote boring things as I possibly can to spend more time listening to customers? And that, in and of itself, I think will make people wildly more productive that are in these high level IC roles and allow them to uh, frankly just up level themselves in the organization because they're going to have so much more insight and information by having those regular conversations with customers.
I agree, Gabe. And both you and I have customer facing roles. I think the interesting thing here is this is a powered by success podcast. And Gabe, you left success, not to drag you in on this as well. But I want to talk a little bit more about your sales role here in a minute. But being close to the customer, I totally agree. And I think, in the future, we'll talk about this in more detail, like hint, hint here on a future episode. But when it comes to AI, I agree with you. Being close to that customer, having that customer facing role is important.
Well, and frankly, as we think about careers of the future and what people should be thinking about, if you are not in a customer, if you're not in a role that's close to the customer, I would be concerned about the long term the longevity of what that kind of career looks like because it's very difficult for AI to replicate the conversation that happens with a customer and the understanding their needs, understanding their desires, understanding the the tools that they're using and how to make those things better. And again, as I just think about where careers are going, if you're not in a customer facing role, I really think people need to consider how they can be getting themselves into that role. That's one of the best things I shouldn't say that's one of the best things. That is the best thing that I ever did in my career was pushing myself out of my comfort zone from I used to work in finance and accounting and I was totally internal facing. I never talked to customers. I was always talking to my leadership team or, C-level folks or whatever. And those are great experiences, but it's a very different thing than being outside of your organization. And the best thing I ever did for my career was take that leap of faith to push myself out of that comfort zone and start getting in front of more customers. And it is hard, and you are going to fall on your face a lot. Zach, I'm sure you've struggled through this as well, right? Like, not every conversation is going to be an absolute delight, but it's really allowed me to, I think, be in a much better position now than the career trajectory that I was on before.
And Gabe, one of the things, I joked about you leaving success and moving into sales, but one of the things you mentioned was everyone's selling. Talk to me about that. What are we selling here?
Well, yeah, I wanted to put this in here because I feel like there's a negative connotation that happens with quote unquote sales. And people have this perception of a sales role as the used car salesman, or, somebody who's trying to push something on somebody that they don't need. That is not modern selling. Modern selling is consultative, especially in a SaaS organization or a technology company, where you're really trying to understand what the customer needs are and how do your solutions align to those needs. That is a modern sales role. And again, like, let's be real, everybody's selling if you're a marketer, you're just selling at scale. You're trying to sell in a much more scalable way where you're communicating to multiple people. Customer success, same thing. You're selling functionality, you're selling renewals. The dirty secret of customer success, and maybe this is a little bit of an overshare, but if you understand the history of where that group came from, it's because at Salesforce specifically, they were churning customers like crazy. They were signing tons and tons of people up, and also tons of customers were leaving out the back end. And they quickly realized we need to do something here to make sure that our customers are adopting and using the functionality that we're selling to them. But we can't afford to go put a bunch of salespeople on that. We need an organization like customer success, who isn't as highly paid as a salesperson, but is going to help with functionality adoption and renewal. And again, that's the reality is that's kind of a sales role.
And Gabe, kind of bridging off that too, um, when to consider sales. I feel like this one's funny. I feel like you're trying to get my success colleagues to go into sales now, but
Yeah.
high performers. You mentioned that they should be considering sales as well, and I want to hear your take on this as well, because for me, sales is not a role I can say I'm interested in today, but I kind of want to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I'm not trying to poach people from other parts of the organization. I think this is just me trying to tell people that are in maybe an earlier part of their career to say, is there an opportunity for me to look at sales as a role? If you're a high performer, should absolutely be considering sales as a career path, especially if you don't want to be a people leader. If you don't want to be a people leader, you are putting a cap on your earnings potential in many parts of the organization. That's just a fact. And that was a balance that I had to kind of work out in my own mind when I was making these decisions about my own career. Is, again, if I don't want to be a people leader in certain parts of the organization, then there's only so much money I'm going to earn. But as you move into a sales organization, there's a lot of opportunity to earn more. And sales are massive organizations. I was doing some research on this, Act, just to see, like, in a SaaS or a high tech environment, what percentage of employees are in the sales organization. I looked at a company, Snowflake. They sell data and AI and a bunch of other stuff. 56% of their employees are in sales. DocuSign, another massive kind of SaaS tech company, 64% of their employees are in sales. On average, 30 to 40% of employees in a tech role or in a SaaS organization roll to a sales org. So these are massive organizations. And again, it's not trying to sell people things that they don't need. It's genuinely actively listening to people and understanding what their needs are, and then how do your solutions align to those needs. And people who treat it like a proper profession and really think about what are the things that I can do to improve my sales process and methodology, they're going to be wildly successful.
I agree, Gabe. And I think the last topic I want to talk about here as we wrap up is influence. And you mentioned that one of the most important things anyone can learn is to influence without power. So how do we, drive change when maybe someone doesn't work directly for you? Or
How do you take an idea that you have and influence back up the chain? That's probably one of the most important things we do as employees. And sometimes it's making it seem like their idea, right? Like that can always that can be a successful strategy, or just having a really well thought out thought around a really well thought out process of, okay, if we change this, here's how it's going to be impactful for the organization, here's how it aligns to our strategic goals and priorities, those sorts of things. But yeah, the influence piece of this is really important, Zach, because again, there are very few people in an organization that can influence just based on title. Most of us are going to have to influence people who we don't have any power over. They don't work for us. Maybe they're our peers. Maybe they're our boss, as I mentioned before. Maybe they're even a couple of levels up, right? But thinking about influence, and the three kind of major categories I wanted to talk through here, Zach, are gratitude and generosity. So I guess that's maybe four: gratitude, generosity, reciprocity, and liking. So just to hit on the gratitude and generosity piece of this, I wanted to tell the story that I had, and this was me, learning how to be more gracious and how to be more generous. And this is a few years ago. I had worked on a project, and to be frank, I had done most of the work on the project, but I did have a colleague that I had partnered with a little bit on it. And I sent an email to the customer, CCing this colleague and CCing a couple of other people and talking about this work that we had done. And I made a mistake. I used I too much in that conversation, in that communication. I did this, I did that. That was not gracious. It was not generous, because I did receive support from other people in the organization on that. And my boss at the time reached out to me and she was like, "Hey, I want to point out the fact that, there were other people that contributed to this. And when I saw this email, it was a lot of I and it wasn't a lot of we, or we partnered together or anything like that." And that was something I really took on. And I had to, be honest with myself that I was like, yeah, totally made a mistake there. Right. So it's something that I'm particularly sensitive to now. And anytime I'm communicating out, when, Zach, you and I partner together on something, or I partner with a colleague together on something, that partnership word is really important. That we word is really important. When you're communicating up to your boss or communicating externally, work that you've done with somebody, it's so important to make sure to use those words, because others are going to see that. And if they feel like you're taking credit for work that they did, they are not going to want to work with you going forward, and you're not going to be able to influence in the way that you want to influence going forward. So, learn from my mistakes, right? Like I think there's a great opportunity there just to be more inclusive in your communication.
hey, Gabe, you've got 20 years of mistakes, so I'm always happy to learn
So
from
many
your 20 compared
mistakes.
to my 3. But I think that's great. And then, Gabe, just to kind of quickly round out here, um, what else can we do with the influence?
Yeah, so I mentioned reciprocity, and this is something that's come up, Zach, multiple times. It can be used from a marketing perspective. I was joking with my wife about this actually last night, because um, there's this woman at school pickup, and she really wants people to turn off their cars, so they don't idle when they're waiting to pick up their kids in line, because it's very bad for the environment, and all these kids are standing around and they're breathing all these terrible fumes that are coming out of cars. So the way that she's done this is she goes around and she gives a small sticker to people, or like a little card with something on it, and it's, thank you for turning off your car, and there's a little thing on there. She's creating reciprocity. It's the same reason that, you know nonprofit organizations send you, little stickers for, like an address sticker in the mail and things like that, right? It's because they know that if they give you something, you're more likely to give them something back. Well, the same thing works in a work environment too. If I want something from somebody in the future, they're much more likely to do that thing if I've done something for them. So this is the part where sometimes you have to put in a little bit of proactive effort. If you want people to listen, you've got to think about, what are the things that I can do proactively? And Zach, I think you're really good about this. When you're going and asking for something from somebody, you're not just bringing them a problem. You're like, hey, these are all of the ways that I've thought through this. This is the data that I've looked at. And I think it's a really smart way to approach any of these conversations.
And Gabe, I just hope you turn off your Tesla when you pick up your kids from schools now.
I had that exact conversation with her. I was like, well, I get out and I go and pick up, I like actually turn the car off and get out. But yes, I did tell her, I was like, well, I have an electric car, so I'm good. But yeah, most people just sit in the line and, they're all this stuff's shooting out the back of the car and the kids are running out from school, breathing all that crap. It's not great. Right. So I love what she's trying to do. And she didn't even think about it from a reciprocity perspective. Her and I were having this conversation, but it was really smart on her part to just give you a small thing, because again, and she's asking for a small thing. It's not like she's asking for $100 or, a big commitment from somebody. It's just turn off your car when you're sitting in the line. So, small ask, and she's providing something for that small ask.
And the last one here, Gabe, you mentioned was uh, being likable, which I feel like that's pretty self-explanatory.
It
I don't
sort
know
of
how deep
is.
you want to dive into that one, but yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, being likable goes a long way, and it sort of aligns to the two bullets above. If you're the person who has gratitude, if you're the person who's generous, if you're the person who's constantly approaching something with a, you know, I'm not just looking to get something out of you. I'm looking to, help you and those sorts of things. You're going to be considered more likable. And the reality is people want to do business with people that they like. Whether that's they like you because you guys have something, there's something in common there, or whether they like you because you've been able to provide them some benefit, over the years. Both of those things are going to help you be more likable. And if we go back to the conversation, Zach, around people considering a sales role, that's obviously super important for folks, who would be considering that as a career path. And I guess I'd be curious to hear your opinion on this, Zach, just because, kind of like, did did sales even occur to you as like a potential career path, as you were coming out of college? Like, did you have friends who were like, I'm going into sales, like that's the thing that I want to do? Was that a conversation that happened?
Well, it's interesting because in my college, within our college of business, we had a professional sales department.
Mm-hmm.
So it was relatively new at the time. I do have some friends that took that path. One of my best friends from college took that path. Um, Me personally, I was not. I was the more creative, the marketing, the data, the finance. So I didn't really look into the sales too much, but like I said, it was becoming a new thing. They
It's
spun up a
interesting
whole
that it
center
was.
around it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that it was becoming a new thing, and obviously colleges are going to create
Sales is
those
not
sorts
a
of
new
things.
thing.
Well, sales isn't a new thing, right? But I think the way people think about sales and the way people are approaching it, hopefully, is a little bit more of a profession. There are ways that you can do that job a heck of a lot better. It's not just about, schmoozing and being likable. Like, that is a component of it, but it's also, again, active listening, really thinking about deeply about what that problem is. It's a lot of the psychology stuff that you and I talk about, Zach, around, the psychology of how people buy and what is their ultimate reason for purchasing something, whether that's purchasing something in their personal life or whether that's purchasing something in their professional life. It's a lot of the same things go into those desires.
Yeah, and I don't get paid by the University of Wyoming, but I had to pull it up. It's the Center for Professional Sales. It's accredited by at least three different organizations here, and I thought it was funny here too, Gabe. At the top paragraph of their website, it talks about creating partnerships and opportunities to prepare students for success in our ever-changing business world. So,
Mm.
like I said, sales is not new, but I think this new angle or this new approach to sales, I like the term professional sales, is what we are seeing, is a lot of what we talked about here today, Gabe, with what you do.
Well, and I see this a lot with my colleagues. Like, we have a lot of really professional salespeople that we work with here that do such a fantastic job. And again, it's not I'm just trying to push something on you that you don't need. And that, I think, is the big misnomer that I'd love for people to come away from this conversation with is, it's if you're considering a role in a job in sales, it doesn't, like, yes, you have to ask for the close. Yes, you're ultimately going to have to ask for the business, but oftentimes that asking for the business is such a natural outcome of the conversation that you've had with the customer already that it doesn't feel like it has to be pushy. And to go back to the which path do you want your career to take, people leadership or high level individual contributor, you can do really well as a high level individual contributor in a sales role. And for that, to go back to really the beginning of this conversation, Zach, around people looking for progression in their career and Gen Z specifically looking for progression in a really short period of time. If you're not pushing yourself into these other parts of the organization, you might not have as much growth, career trajectory as you a positive trajectory as you would want, but pushing into these other orgs is a great way to do that.
Well said, Gabe. And that does bring us to the top of the podcast, or is it the bottom of the podcast? The end of the
There you
podcast
go.
here. So thank you everyone for tuning into Buffering. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast app and to share it with your friends and colleagues. And for more insights and updates, be sure to connect with Gabe and I on LinkedIn.